The courtroom buzzed with a chaotic undercurrent, every moment leading to this. The defense team was poised, their faces a picture of confidence, but it was clear something was about to disrupt everything. Julian Carter, his hands trembling beneath the table, fought to maintain his composure. His mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other in a blur of fear and hope. Across the room, the prosecution team sat, eyes locked on the judge, their stoic expressions betraying nothing. Then, as the judge's gavel came down with the force of a final verdict, everything changed. The words that followed left everyone in shock. "I have evidence that will change the course of this trial," the voice echoed. The words were spoken by someone everyone had given up on, someone believed to have disappeared. A hush fell over the room. The judge, caught in a rare moment of uncertainty, looked up sharply. The defense attorney, confident until now, stood frozen, his suit pressed neatly, but his hands gripped tightly by his sides. Julian's heart pounded in his chest. His mind was spinning. Who was this mysterious figure, and why did they choose now to step forward? The silence in the room was deafening, thick with the weight of what was to come. Julian's palms began to sweat. The truth, long buried, was about to surface, but at what cost? No one knew who they could trust anymore. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Julian realized that his very survival now rested in the hands of the unknown witness. A figure as elusive as the truth itself. Julian Carter's breath caught in his throat as he watched the witness step forward. Who were they? How did they know to come forward now, when everything seemed lost? A part of him wanted to run, to escape the overwhelming pressure mounting with each passing second. But he knew that there was nowhere to go. His fate had already been sealed in the court of public opinion. The whispers, the doubts, the accusations, they had all weighed him down like an anchor. And now, just when he thought he might sink, this stranger was offering him a lifeline. But would it be enough? The moment hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. As the witness advanced, their every step felt like a slow-motion unraveling of his reality. It was his last chance. But would the truth even set him free, or would it bury him deeper into the darkness of this courtroom, this spectacle of justice turned cruel? Julian could only watch, unable to shake the feeling that the next words spoken could either deliver him salvation or ruin him completely. The tension was suffocating. As the witness approached the front of the room, the judge motioned for silence. The room held its collective breath. Julian could feel his heart pounding against his chest, the walls of the courtroom closing in. Every eye was on him, waiting for his reaction. His life, his future, rested in the hands of this person he had never seen before. For a moment he wondered if he should speak out, if he should demand answers. But he couldn't. He had no voice in this trial anymore. His silence had been a part of the narrative built against him. The witness reached the front and turned toward the judge, holding up the envelope with an air of finality. "This will change everything," they said. Julian's stomach twisted. What were they about to reveal? And more importantly, who were they really protecting? The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, the audience hanging on every movement. Julian's pulse quickened as the witness slowly approached the prosecution table. He could see the subtle shift in the prosecutor's demeanor, the way her fingers tightened around her legal pad. It was as if the entire foundation of the case was beginning to crumble in front of them. The defense attorney, who had seemed so sure just moments ago, now appeared almost disoriented, his lips pursed tightly, his mind clearly racing for a way out. The words that the witness had spoken, "This will change everything," rang in Julian's mind like a death knell. He wasn't sure if it would be salvation or destruction. As the witness laid the envelope on the table before the prosecutor, Julian's hands clenched into fists under the table. There was no going back. The evidence contained within that envelope was going to change everything. But would it clear his name or further entrench him in this nightmare? Every instinct screamed at him to ask questions, to demand the truth. But the truth had always been elusive, and in this moment, the witness held all the power. The prosecutor's face tightened, her eyes darting between the envelope and Julian, but she remained silent, waiting for the next move. In this game, the silence was as loud as any words. The silence in the room was unbearable. Julian watched as the prosecutor slowly opened the envelope, her fingers shaking ever so slightly. He couldn't tell if it was fear or anger that caused her hand to tremble. The room seemed to grow even quieter as the contents were revealed. The piece of paper, the key to his fate, was held aloft between the prosecutor's fingers. Julian's thoughts raced. Could it be the missing piece of evidence? Could it finally exonerate him? Or would it be the final nail in his coffin, sealing his fate forever? The judge's voice broke through the tension. "We will take a recess," he declared, his words carrying the weight of finality. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of motion, but Julian couldn't focus on the chaos around him. His mind was fixated on the one thing that mattered, the evidence that could either shatter his hopes or rebuild them. The prosecutor stood frozen, the paper held high, as if unsure of what to do next. Julian leaned forward, eyes locked on the paper, the uncertain future of his life hanging in the balance. The courtroom was abuzz with whispered conversations, but Julian couldn't hear any of it. His mind was consumed by the image of the envelope the prosecutor now held. It was as if the world had narrowed to just him and that paper. Was this the break he had been waiting for, or would it seal his fate once and for all? His thoughts churned, but his body remained still, betraying the storm inside. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet weight pressing on his chest. He felt his pulse quicken with every second that passed. The judge's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m., he announced, his voice stern. But even it couldn't erase the anticipation that hung thick in the air. Julian's gaze remained fixed on the prosecutor. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and she knew the significance of what she held. This wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon, and it could either strike Julian down or lift him from the pit of despair he had fallen into. Outside the courtroom, the press was already clamoring for the story. They knew something big had just unfolded, but they didn't know what. The atmosphere was electric, crackling with the promise of something huge. As Julian was escorted out of the courtroom, his mind couldn't stop racing. Who had sent that witness? And what did they know that could change everything? The next day, Julian stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His suit felt heavier than it ever had before, the weight of the courtroom's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what awaited him in the trial today, but he knew the stakes had never been higher. The mysterious witness, the evidence, everything was moving so quickly, like a tide he couldn't control. But one thing was clear. This was his fight for survival. As the trial began, Julian took his seat once again, his eyes scanning the room, trying to anticipate the next move. The defense attorney beside him was whispering something about strategy, but Julian wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, tracing the steps that had led him here. The case was no longer just a fight for his freedom. It was a battle for his very soul. The prosecutor stood up, her face set in stone, as she began to address the court. She had a plan. He could see it in the way her eyes gleamed. It was all coming down to this moment. The courtroom was silent, save for the prosecutor's voice, as the tension in the air thickened, and Julian felt himself slip further into the abyss of uncertainty. The trial progressed in fits and starts, the courtroom swinging between tense silence and heated exchanges. But it was the moment when the prosecutor called for a recess that had Julian on edge. The witness who had appeared the day before was now expected to testify, and Julian knew that what came next could either exonerate him or bury him deeper. As the recess was called, Julian was led into a small holding room. The door clicked shut behind him, and he was alone, facing nothing but his thoughts. His heart raced as he paced the room, trying to think of a way out of the corner he was now backed into. His mind replayed every moment from the trial, every word, every glance exchanged. It was clear now that the witness wasn't just a random person. They had a plan, and they were playing a dangerous game. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The world outside the door seemed distant, muted, and Julian's thoughts spiraled further. Who could he trust? Who was playing whom? When the door finally opened, Julian braced himself for the next round of revelations, knowing that whatever came next would shape the course of his fate. The moment the door opened, Julian knew the stakes had just been raised. The witness entered the room, but this time, there was no mystery about them. They were here to testify, and whatever secrets they held were about to be laid bare. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the witness took the stand, their expression calm but unreadable. Julian tried to steady his breath, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. This was it. The moment that would either free him or condemn him. He had to stay focused, had to concentrate on the words that were about to come out of the witness' mouth. His defense attorney whispered something to him, but he barely registered the words. His entire attention was fixed on the witness. The witness was speaking now, and the words that spilled from their lips were devastating. Julian's heart sank as the revelation hit him. The witness knew everything. Not just about the case, but about the people involved. About Julian. And there it was, the betrayal. The truth he had hoped would set him free was now the weapon that threatened to destroy him. The words from the witness felt like a heavy blow to Julian, each syllable crashing down like a wave, pulling him further under. His mind spun with the revelations. The truths laid bare in front of the court. Everything he had believed about this case, about the people involved, had been a lie. His lawyer's face was a mask of frustration, unable to counter the powerful evidence the witness was presenting. Julian felt the walls close in around him. There was no escape. The gavel struck, and the court was adjourned for the day. But the damage had already been done. Julian's mind raced. His life was no longer his own. It was a puzzle to be solved by others, each person twisting the pieces for their own gain. He had come here to fight for his life, but it was beginning to feel like he was fighting a battle he could never win. As the crowd began to disperse, Julian stood, still dazed, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. He had no answers, only questions. But one thing was clear. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, and there was no turning back now. The days following the testimony had been a blur for Julian. The weight of the witness's revelations hung over him, casting long shadows over every thought. The once bustling courtroom now felt like a suffocating cage, the walls closing in with every passing hour. His defense attorney had become quieter, less confident, as though the very ground they had stood on was shifting beneath them. Julian found himself wondering if anyone, even his own lawyer, truly believed he was innocent anymore. The questions were piling up, each more insistent than the last. Was this all a setup? Had he been framed from the start, or was he simply caught in a web of his own making? Outside the courthouse, the press had gone into overdrive, the headlines reflecting the chaos of the trial, the mystery of the witness, and the ever-deepening conspiracy that was beginning to take shape. Julian couldn't escape the prying eyes, even as he sat in the back of the defense room, staring blankly at the wall. His hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water, the motion slow and deliberate, his reflection in the glass more of a stranger than ever before. He had thought he knew who he was, a man wrongly accused, fighting for his life. But now doubts crept in like silent whispers, eating away at him. Was he innocent, or was he something far worse? The courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and the silence that followed only deepened a growing sense of dread. Someone was coming. He had no idea who, but he knew that nothing would be the same after this meeting. It was as though the moment of truth had finally arrived. But what would it reveal? The next day, Julian was summoned back to the courtroom. His heart pounded as he walked through the corridors, the murmurs of the press echoing around him, the sound almost suffocating. He didn't know what to expect today. The revelation from the witness had already shaken the foundation of the case, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was this witness, really? What more did they know? The thought of facing them again filled Julian with dread. But as much as he feared what they might reveal, he couldn't help but feel an undeniable pull, a sense that this was his last chance. When he entered the courtroom, the eyes of everyone seemed to follow him. The judge, the jury, the spectators, all were waiting for the next move, the next bombshell. The prosecution had a quiet confidence now, their case tightening with every passing day. Julian's defense, on the other hand, was crumbling. It was becoming harder to find a way out, to make the pieces fit into the narrative of innocence he had clung to for so long. The prosecutor stood tall, watching him with an air of unspoken victory, her expression unreadable. But then the witness spoke again, this time from the stand. Their voice was calm, deliberate. They were about to give the final piece of the puzzle, and Julian's stomach twisted in knots as he realized that the truth, whatever it was about to break wide open. Would it exonerate him, or would it shatter his world once and for all? The witness's testimony hit like a thunderclap. With each word they spoke, Julian's world seemed to fracture further. They described events he had long buried, secrets he thought no one knew. His heart raced, the blood pounding in his ears as he realized that the truth was far darker than he could have imagined. The prosecutor's smug expression said it all. They had him. It was over. But then a single thought cut through the chaos in his mind. If they knew all of this, what were they hiding? What was the bigger picture? As the witness continued, Julian felt something stir within him, a spark of defiance. He couldn't just give up, not without knowing the whole truth. The cracks in the story were widening, and Julian knew that if he could just find a way to expose them, there might still be hope. The defense attorney leaned over, whispering frantically, but Julian didn't hear the words. His mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragments of memories, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. The witness testimony was a revelation, but it was also a riddle. Something didn't add up, and Julian had to figure out what it was before the final blow was delivered. The room seemed to close in on Julian as the days dragged on. The trial was at its climax, but instead of feeling closer to the truth, Julian felt more distant from it than ever. The walls of the courtroom seemed like a cage now, and with every word spoken, every piece of evidence introduced, he was more convinced that the entire system was stacked against him. The defense attorney had become increasingly desperate, offering weak counter-arguments, but it was clear to everyone that the tide had turned. Despite the pressure mounting against him, Julian knew he couldn't just surrender. The witness had given him more than just testimony. They had given him a clue, a crack in the facade. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something he hadn't fully understood. With no one else to turn to, Julian began to piece together the fragments of his past. He remembered conversations, faces, fleeting moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now they were his only hope. He was about to make a decision that would either ruin him or save him. He had one chance, one opportunity to turn the tide back in his favor. And he was ready to take it. The final moments of the trial were upon them. Julian could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The prosecutor's closing argument was sharp, pointed, and brutal. They painted him as a villain, a man driven by greed and ambition, someone who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. The jury listened in rapt attention, the verdict almost certain in their minds. But as Julian prepared for the worst, something inside him shifted. He stood up, interrupting the prosecutor, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable force. "I won't let you dictate my fate, not like this," he said. The room fell into a stunned silence. He was ready to take the stand, to finally speak his truth. For the first time in this trial, Julian felt in control. His voice, though shaky, was filled with a conviction that had been absent until now. The entire room was watching him, and this time he was ready. The truth would be his weapon, and he would use it to tear down the walls that had been built around him. No matter the outcome, Julian knew this was his moment. Julian's decision to speak had rattled the courtroom. The following morning, the air was dense with anticipation, as if the very walls had been waiting for this confrontation. He stood at the defense table, eyes locked on the jury, willing them to see beyond the prosecution's carefully woven narrative. His voice, though calm, carried an urgency that commanded silence. Every word he spoke was deliberate, each syllable laced with the desperation of a man standing on the precipice. The prosecutor watched with hawk-like focus, searching for a flaw, a crack to exploit. Julian could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. The truth he had buried for years was about to come to light, but it wasn't the truth the court expected. He wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling a lie that had taken root in every mind present. The jury shifted in their seats, caught between doubt and conviction. This was no longer just a trial, it was a war for the soul of the story itself. And Julian was prepared to fight, until there was nothing left in him to give. As Julian spoke, the room seemed to shift. His words weren't just a defense, they were an attack on the very foundation of the case. He painted a picture of manipulation, of truths twisted into lies, and of the witness as more than a bystander, as a participant in the deception. The murmurs among the spectators grew louder, the energy in the room electric. The judge called for order, but the damage had been done. Julian had planted a seed of doubt. The prosecutor stepped forward, her measured pace betraying the calculation behind each step. "So you expect us to believe that this witness, the one who brought evidence against you, is the true architect of this crime?" she asked. Julian met her gaze without flinching. "Not just expect," he said, "I can prove it." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. In that instant, the dynamic had shifted again. The hunted was becoming the hunter. The judge allowed Julian to present his counter-narrative. He walked to the evidence table, pulling a folder from the stack. "This isn't just a trial about what happened," he began. "It's about why it happened and who wanted it to." His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of emotion was impossible to miss. He laid out phone records, financial transfers, and a timeline that pointed directly to the witness. Every page turned was another blow to the image the prosecution had built. The jury leaned in, following each detail. The witness shifted uneasily in their seat, their calm veneer beginning to crack. Julian pressed on, showing how the evidence in the mysterious envelope could only have been obtained by someone with insider access, someone who had everything to gain from framing him. The court clerk moved to admit the new documents into evidence, and Julian could feel the momentum swinging in his favor. The witness was called back to the stand. The prosecutor's questions were sharp, but Julian's cross-examination cut deeper. "Tell us," Julian said, voice calm but unyielding, "how did you obtain documents that only someone inside the company could have?" The witness hesitated, their eyes darting toward the prosecutor. "I was given them," they said finally. "By whom?" Julian pressed. Silence. The judge leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the pause. The gallery was dead quiet, every ear straining for the next word. "If you don't answer, we'll have no choice but to draw our own conclusions," Julian added. The witnesses' lips trembled, their composure unraveling. It wasn't a confession yet, but it was the closest Julian had come to breaking them. And in a trial like this, even hesitation could be damning. By the end of the day, the courtroom was a battlefield littered with the debris of shredded narratives. The prosecution's case was wounded, the witness' credibility in question, and the jury left to wrestle with their growing uncertainty. Julian sat back, the tension in his shoulders loosening just slightly. He knew this wasn't over, but for the first time, he saw a path forward, narrow, treacherous, but possible. As the judge adjourned for the day, the prosecutor's glare followed him out, a silent promise that she wasn't done. Outside, the evening air hit him like a shock, the cool wind carrying the murmurs of the press and the faint hum of the city. Julian took a slow breath. Tomorrow would bring the next battle, but tonight he had earned a reprieve. A small victory perhaps, but one that could change everything. Morning light bled through the high windows, and the courtroom felt like a sealed vault of breathless intent. Julian felt the weight of every gaze, but he refused to bow. His attorney whispered strategy, yet he heard only the thud of truth in his chest. The judge cleared his throat, and the room steadied like a ship before a storm. The prosecutor said, "Proceed if you dare," and the words hooked the air. Julian said, "I will," and stepped toward the stand with a calm he did not fully own. The witness watched, jaw set, a fortress built from half-truths and fear. Julian said, "You knew the access codes before the breach," and a ripple moved the gallery. He laid out timestamps like stepping stones across a dark river. The pattern spoke louder than any plea, and the jury leaned in as if to read his pulse. He said, "You framed me to bury a bigger crime," and silence crawled over the wood and brass like frost. Julian set a slim recorder on the evidence cart, its metal case winking like a dare. He said, "This log captures your midnight call to our security vendor," and the murmur lifted. The prosecutor stepped closer, voice low and clipped, and asked, "Foundation for this exhibit?" He answered with chain of custody steps like rungs on a ladder to daylight. The judge nodded, measured and grave, and allowed the playing. A voice filled the room, cool and careful, bargaining for blind access. The witness blinked once, twice, and the mask slipped at the edges. Julian said, "You purchased silence, then sold me to the crowd." The gallery hushed as if sound itself were on trial. His throat burned, yet his voice held. He felt the room tilt toward truth, and he did not sway. The recording ended with a click that felt like a verdict's ghost. The prosecutor exhaled, then said, "Explain the payment trail," and her tone held iron. Julian traced transfers through shell firms like tracks in fresh snow. He named dates, banks, and the quiet corridors where money learns to vanish. The witness said, "You're guessing, but the tremor betrayed the script." Julian said, "You laundered motive, not cash," and the phrase struck the rail. He lifted a photo of a server rack caged behind wire like a captive heart. He said, "You needed me noisy so your harvest ran quiet." The jury stared as if they could see the wires hum. The judge's pen stopped moving, and the room forgot to breathe. Cross-examination turned like a key in an old lock, and the tumblers finally aligned. Julian said, "Who gave you the employee roster encryption seed?" The witness stared at the microphone as if it could swallow him. He glanced at the prosecutor, and a fragile line stretched between them like glass. The prosecutor said, "Answer the question," and the steel in her voice surprised even her. He whispered a name that shook dust from the rafters and cut through months of fog. Julian felt the blood leave his face because the name belonged to his former mentor. He said, "He taught me to trust the audit trail," and bitterness salted the words. The judge tapped the gavel once, a warning, not a storm. The gallery rustled like dry leaves that suddenly remembered wind. The case transformed in a breath, and no one owned the room anymore. Afternoon shadows lengthened, and the trial shed its skin. The prosecutor closed her file, then said, "The state requests a brief recess to review new implications." The judge allowed 10 minutes that felt like new weather. Julian sat very still, learning how to breathe in a different story. He said, "They built the fire and handed me the matches," and his voice held no tremor. His attorney touched his sleeve, astonished to find hope still warm. The witness slumped, a lighthouse gone dark, and stared at the floorboards. The gallery no longer looked hungry. It looked human, wary and awake. The judge returned, eyes clear, and asked for offers of stipulation. The prosecutor said, "We will revisit charges," and the words rang like a distant bell. Julian did not smile. He only straightened, ready for the next hard truth. Morning returned with the chill of unfinished business, and the courthouse hummed like a hive. Julian felt the name of his mentor sitting like a stone behind his ribs. The prosecutor arrived early, eyes rimmed with resolve instead of sleep. The judge took the bench with the stillness of a drawn bow. Julian said, "Today I finish this," and his attorney nodded without promise. The witness stared at the floor as if it held a friendlier verdict. The prosecutor said, "The state recalls the witness and moves to join a party." The courtroom gasped as if a window had blown open in winter. Julian watched the gears of law catch, grind and lunge forward. He pictured the old lessons about proof and motive snapping like brittle chalk. He said, "He taught me to trust documents, not smiles." The judge said, "We proceed," and the room settled into a new shape. The witness raised his right hand, and the oath felt heavier than the wood beneath it. The prosecutor's tone cut clean as a chisel through old stone. She said, "Who set the breach in motion, and why did you let him?" He swallowed and said, he wanted the audit system blinded before the merger. Julian tasted metal in his mouth where fear used to live. The gallery shifted as if a tide rolled under their benches. The prosecutor said, name him again, and tell this court what he paid. He said the name, and even its syllables seemed to bruise the air. He described a back room, a sealed envelope, and a price for loyalty. Julian said, you traded light for silence and called it duty. The judge leaned forward as if to hear the truth arrive without stumbling. The prosecutor laid a fresh exhibit like a trapdoor at the court's feet. She said, these are board minutes altered by the mentor's hand. Julian felt relief and fury circle each other like wary dogs. The clerk passed copies that smelled of toner and reckoning. The witness said, he cut the lines about risk to push the vote. Julian said, he carved out the warnings and left my signature. The jury studied the blacked edges where truth once sat. The prosecutor said, you watched him erase caution, and you helped the erasure. He said, I did, because he promised to fix it before the audit. Julian remembered the day the servers sang like wires in rain. He said, you fixed it by framing me, not by restoring the data. The judge wrote slowly, then looked up, and let the silence hold. Cross-examination fell to Julian like a blade he had earned the right to wield. He said, tell them where the mentor hid the seed key. The witness hesitated, then said, in the off-site locker behind the service map. The prosecutor's pen halted mid-air as if surprised by its own pause. Julian said, code phrase? And the witness whispered, silent ledger. The gallery bent forward as if the room itself leaned. Julian said, you visited that locker 2 hours after the breach. He answered, because he told me to salvage the story. Julian felt heat rise, not rage but the friction of truth on lies. He said, and when I asked where the backups were, he sent you to me. The judge said enough speculation, yet his voice had lost its iron. The witness looked at Julian and said, he feared your memory more than your alibi. Afternoon drifted toward verdict light, and the case finally breathed its harshest air. The prosecutor stood, voice steady, and said, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Carter without prejudice. A tremor passed through the gallery like a string plucked once. Julian did not move, not yet, not until the law finished speaking. The judge said, motion granted, and the gavel fell without thunder. Julian said, justice is not a door, it is a corridor, and his throat burned clean. The witness asked to confer, but the bailiff kept the lanes clear. The prosecutor turned to Julian and said, we will pursue him, meaning the mentor. Julian nodded, because victory tasted like ash and duty mixed. He looked at the jury and said, thank you for listening when truth finally had a voice. The room exhaled, and learned how to hold a different silence. Dusk pooled inside the courthouse, walls still humming with the trial's echo. Julian gripped the rail, meeting the prosecutor's gaze as she said, he's moving funds tonight. The witness hovered near the exit, murmuring, I can take you to the locker. The judge stepped down and said, I won't join you, but I won't look away. Julian answered, we do this clean, or not at all. They drove through rain-slick streets to a storage facility. The prosecutor warned, no missteps. The witness keyed the door and said, back wall, behind the service map. Julian's hand hovered over the latch. Once opened we can't unsee, he said. Cold air spilled from the locker. Inside, drives labeled in a precise hand, a note from the mentor dated to the breach. He prepared for discovery and escape, Julian said. The witness muttered, he promised to fix it. The recorder clicked, sealing the truth. Back in court, monitors glowed with transaction paths. The witness testified, I obeyed him because I feared him. Julian said, he hid the crime inside my shadow. The judge issued a warrant, gavel tapping like a fuse. At sunrise, they stood on the courthouse steps. The prosecutor said, we finish when he speaks under oath. Julian replied, survival isn't victory, but it's a door. The witness lingered alone as the city woke without forgiving.